All right, welcome to Hoops Tonight here at The Volume. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Hope all of you guys are having a great week. We are continuing our top 10 week today with the top 10 non-champions of the last 25 years. This has been the funnest list, the most fun list I've done to this point in the week. It's been really fun just to dig back through NBA history and try to find teams that never won the title, but that were particularly memorable and particularly great. Couple rules here. The team cannot have won a championship in a different season. So, for instance, it can't be like the 2017 Cavs because they're just the 2016 Cavs. They are the champions. They beat the same team with Harrison Barnes instead of KD just 1 year prior. I don't feel like it's really worth it to shout them out. I didn't even include teams like the 2007 Mavs because Dirk Nowitzki and Jason Terry and a different group of role players ended up winning the title just a few years later. So the goal here today is to call attention to teams, specific iterations of teams that never won the title. You guys know the drill. Before we get started, subscribe to the Hoops Tonight YouTube channel so you don't miss any more of our videos. Follow me on Twitter at _JasonLT so you guys don't miss show announcements. Don't forget about our podcast feed wherever you get your podcasts under Hoops Tonight. It's also super helpful if you leave a rating and a review on that front. Jackson's doing great work on our social media feeds on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Make sure you guys follow us over there. And last but not least, if you want to get mailbag questions into our mailbags, just drop them in our full episodes on YouTube in the comments. Put mailbag with a colon and write your question, and we'll get to them weekly throughout the remainder of the season. All right, let's talk some basketball. So again, iterations of teams that never won the title. Number 10, the Chris Paul and Blake Griffin Clippers. They were perennially near the top of the Western Conference in the mid-2010s. They finished with a top 4 seed 5 consecutive years, 2013, 14, 15, 16, and 17. They were the number 1 offense in the league in 2014 and 2015, fueled by a devastating pick-and-roll attack with Chris Paul and 2 unbelievable vertical spacers in Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan. Blake Griffin also had become one of the best forwards in the league at this point in time. He finished second-team All-NBA 3 seasons in a row, including finishing 3rd in MVP voting in 2014. But Blake Griffin and Chris Paul had some pretty significant playoff struggles over their careers for different reasons. Blake, some inconsistent scoring. Chris Paul, weird game management stuff in big spots. And like Chris Paul in particular had some spectacular blow-ups in some big spots. And so they just never made it out of the second round. A couple close calls, a bad blown lead against the Oklahoma City Thunder in a game where Chris Paul really fell apart. Closest they got was probably 2015 in a series where they literally had the Rockets beat so bad that James Harden was on the bench before the bench players for the Rockets ended up sparking a comeback and the Rockets ended up going on to win that series. But this was an excellent regular season team for the better part of the half decade with some excellent top-end talent. They just couldn't get it done on the biggest stage. Number 9, the Kawhi Spurs. To be clear, not the Duncan Parker Ginobili Spurs. I'm referring to 2016 and 2017. This team was built around Apex Kawhi, the guy who logged back-to-back top 3 MVP finishes in 2016 and 2017. They were also built around LaMarcus Aldridge, who they brought over from Portland. LaMarcus actually ended up making an All-NBA team in 2016 with the Spurs. Parker and Ginobili were less involved at this point, although Tony Parker did have himself one hell of a throwback playoff run in the 2017 playoffs, if you guys remember. But this was one of the most successful regular season teams to not win the title. They won 67 games in 2016, and nobody even noticed because the Warriors happened to win 73. That year, they ended up losing to a team that's above them on this list, the Kevin Durant Westbrook Thunder, who were this close to knocking out both the 67-win Spurs and the 73-win Warriors, a team that you will see later on in this list. As we mentioned, we'll talk about them when we get there. But the Spurs ended up going on to win 61 games in 2017 before losing to the Warriors in a weird series. They came out, it's a super bizarre game where they came out and just started really kicking the shit out of the Warriors in game 1. But then, as you guys all remember, Zaza Pachulia runs up underneath Kawhi Leonard on a little baseline jumper on the left side of the floor, sprains his ankle, and we never saw Apex Kawhi in a Spurs jersey ever again after that. He took the floor a few times, but just never looked like the same guy until he was in a Raptors jersey. To be clear, I think it's foolish to say that the Spurs just would have won the series if Kawhi didn't get hurt. Blowouts happen in the NBA. Sometimes you just get punched in the mouth and it's what you need. I think even if the if Kawhi didn't get hurt and the Spurs would have won that game, I think the Warriors would have won that series in 5 or 6 games anyway. I mean, I think that's the greatest team ever assembled that they were going against there. But it doesn't change the fact that this was one of the great non-championship teams in NBA history. Again, winning 128 games over the course of 2 seasons. A truly elite defense anchored by Kawhi Leonard. They were first in defensive rating each of those 2 years. Number 8, the young LeBron Cavs. We saw several different iterations of them over the years surrounding LeBron and then a front court of Zydrunas Ilgauskas and Anderson Varejao. We had kind of like a Larry Hughes, Drew Gooden, Sasha Pavlovich, Daniel Marshall version that ended up making it to the finals in 2007, but they got absolutely crushed. That was kind of fluky off of a truly heroic LeBron performance against the Pistons in Game 5, really his first truly great playoff performance of his career. The version I want to call attention to is more the 2009, 2010 versions of the team. They won 127 games in 2 years. Through a series of trades and signings, they flipped the supporting cast to include a legit secondary ball handler in Mo Williams and a really nice 2-guard in Delonte West, as well as a new group of role players like Wally Szczerbiak and Joe Smith, and eventually in 2010 on Antoine Jameson to provide some scoring in the front court and Shaquille O'Neal. This was the first peak of LeBron James. It kind of reminds me of like a better version of the Giannis that we saw in 2019 and 2020, where he was just clearly far and away the best regular season player in the league, but not as polished of a playoff performer as like Kobe Bryant was during those years. But LeBron won back-to-back MVPs, and the closest they got to winning the title was actually the 2009 team that lost to Orlando. To their credit, to the Magic's credit, they managed to steal home court advantage with a couple of huge shots at the end of those 2 games. Rashard Lewis hit like this weird jab step hesitation 3 from the top of the key, and then in Game 1. And then Hedo Turkoglu hit like a little mid-range pull-up jump shot going to his right at the end of Game 2. And each of those shots put the Cavs up against it. LeBron happened to steal one back with that buzzer-beating game winner off the top of the key, but the Magic stole home court, and then the home teams held serve the rest of the series, and the Magic ended up going on to win that series in 6. So that was probably the closest that the early LeBron Cavs got to winning the title, but ultimately not close enough to be further up on this list. They were a really fun regular season team. They defended at a super high level. LeBron was must-see television in those days because of the highlight reel he was putting up every night, but they just didn't have the scoring juice that they needed, especially down the roster, to make a legitimate title run with a flawed, younger version of LeBron James. Number 7, the Jason Kidd Nets. They were built around Jason Kidd, Kenyon Martin, and Richard Jefferson. They were the best defense in the league during their 2 finals runs in 2002 and 2003. Kind of similar to what we think of the Thunder as now, is like this super elite defense that was hyper athletic and forced a bunch of turnovers, and the classic like defense to transition team, consistently near the top of the league in steals and forcing turnovers and fast break points and points off of turnovers and all of that kind of stuff. They got swept by the Lakers in 2002, but they were pretty close in 2003. They lost just 2 games in the entire East playoff run that year, and they pushed the Spurs to 6 in the finals. Their best chance was in Game 3. They had stolen home court in Game 2, and they were in a close game down the stretch in Game 3, but Parker, Ginobili, and Duncan just killed them down the stretch, and they never regained control from there. Number 6, the 7 seconds or less Suns. They were built around the back-to-back MVP of the league, Steve Nash, a perfect pick-and-roll partner for him in Amari Stoudemire, and a deep group of good role players, guys like Sean Marion, Rajat Bell, Boris Diaw, Leandro Barbosa, and they were the best offense in the league during their era. They made several playoff runs, 2 Western Conference Finals runs in 2005 and in 2006. But in those years, it kind of felt like they lost to better teams. They kind of just got handled by the Spurs in 2005, and it felt like the Mavs were better in 2006. The one that they'll be kicking themselves about for years is the 2007 second round series against the Spurs. They ended up losing in 6, and it was heartbreaking. They lost home court in Game 1, but they won it back in Game 4 on a masterpiece game from Steve Nash. But in that game, he ended up getting shoved into the scorer's table. And in the ensuing kind of like scrum, there were 3 players that were suspended: Boris Diaw, Amari Stoudemire, and Robert Horry. An arrangement that very clearly favored San Antonio. And so the Spurs were able to win a very close game in Game 5 in Phoenix with Stoudemire and Diaw out. And I think there's a good chance that the Spurs end up losing that series and the Suns advance if those suspensions don't occur. And like the Jazz team waiting in the finals, the Suns were going to beat them. And we all know that Cavs team was just not ready, right? So like that semifinal series between the Spurs and the Suns was basically the NBA finals, and it ended up swinging on a questionable set of suspensions. The 7 seconds or less Suns are pretty high on this list among the great non-champions in NBA history. Number 5, the Dwight Howard Magic. They were built around Dwight Howard at the absolute peak of his powers. The roster was one of the really great early spacing teams, right? A lot of like spread pick and roll was shooting and spread post-ups was shooting. Some good ball handlers, guys like Hito Turkoglu was one of the old school, like big-bodied pick and roll players, and Jameer Nelson, who was a very good pick and roll player as well. And then they just had a ton of spot-up shooting. They were the best three-point shooting team in the league during this time frame. And that presented a huge problem on both ends of the floor for teams with Dwight Howard's rim protection and all of that shooting that they had him spaced with on the other end of the floor. They were the best defense in the league in 2009, and they were top 5 in both offense and defense in 2010. But 2009 is the year they'll always look back at as their best opportunity. Those of you guys who remember, Courtney Lee ended up smoking a wide open layup at the end of game 2 that would have stolen home court in the series. And then if you guys remember, Derek Fisher hit a like transition pull-up 3 along the right wing that tied game 4 and sent it to overtime. And those are 2 games that very easily could have gone the other way. That very easily could have been a 3-2 Orlando Magic lead heading back to Los Angeles with the Magic having 2 chances to steal 1 game. This was a scary good team that was way ahead of its time and way closer to hoisting the trophy than people realize. I'm going to cheat a little bit with number 4. We are extremely excited to announce our new presenting sponsor, Hard Rock Bet. Everyone knows and loves the Hard Rock hotels and casinos, and now you can use the top-rated Hard Rock Bet Sportsbook to place all of your bets all NFL season and beyond. Hard Rock Bet is the only legal sportsbook in the state of Florida and is also available in Arizona, Ohio, New Jersey, Indiana, Tennessee, Virginia, Illinois, and Colorado, with more states launching all the time. You can also play on Hard Rock Bet's online casino if you're in New Jersey. So from here on out, you're going to see us use betting lines from Hard Rock Bet, especially as we get into the NBA season. It'll be a big part of our coverage from there. And as we gear up for the NFL season, sign up for Hard Rock Bet and make a $5 bet, and you'll get $150 in bonus bets if you win. Head over to Hard Rock Bet and sign up and make your first deposit today. The Reggie Miller Pacers. I'm cheating because technically their best chance was in the year 2000, which was more than 25 years ago. But they had another really close call in 2004 with an old Reggie Miller. At this point, the team was built around Jermaine O'Neal, who was 3rd in MVP voting that year, and Ron Artest, who won Defensive Player of the Year in that particular season. They were one of the great defenses of that era that just kind of ended up falling behind the way we view the Detroit Pistons, because the Detroit Pistons happened to win their defensive slugfest, and they happened to be the team that upset the Lakers. But they ended up losing to the Pistons in 6 in one of the craziest defensive slugfest series in the history of the NBA. And the whole series might have flipped if it wasn't for one of the greatest defensive plays in the history of the league. Tayshaun Prince, after Chauncey Billups got stripped in a late shot clock situation, the Pistons were up to, quick outlet pass. Reggie Miller looks wide open, running the floor. And Tayshaun Prince comes out of absolutely nowhere to block that shot and secure a Pistons win. That could have gone to OT. Pacers win that game. They go up 2-0 in the series. NBA history tells us you go up 2-0, you usually win. And as we know, that older Lakers team that was waiting in the finals was pretty shaky and ripe for upset. So like that was one of those big what ifs in NBA history. Tayshaun Prince doesn't block that shot. Maybe the Pacers go up 2-0. That's also one of the great defenses in the league. Maybe they end up being the team that upsets the Lakers and having the memory of being the great defensive team of that era. But since we have 2004 as the framework, we can take a minute to show some appreciation to the Reggie Miller Pacers as a whole. They made 5 conference finals runs with Reggie, including 3 in a row in the late 1990s, culminating in a very close attempt in the year 2000 that left them just 2 wins away from the trophy. And that series swung on Kobe's first big playoff moment, first big NBA Finals moment, I should say. They're in OT, Shaq fouls out, Kobe gets 3 buckets right down the stretch of overtime, and that ends up stealing game 4. And then in game 6 of that series, the Pacers were within 1 with 1.5 minutes left. So definitely one of the great teams, the Reggie Miller Pacers over the course of that decade from the early 90s to the early 2000s, one of the great teams to never win the title. Number 3, the Harden Chris Paul Rockets, also known as the team that was built to beat the Warriors. The Warriors were this team that was built on the offensive principle of ball and player movement, and they would just put you in the blender and chew you up and spit you out. And the Rockets thought, well, what if we switch everything? That way we can always be waiting on the other end of the screen. We might be able to shut down these screening actions and potentially stagnate them and make them play iso ball, which is not Warriors basketball. And so they spent all season becoming really the first great switching defense. And on the other end of the floor, after acquiring Chris Paul, they built a masterful offense on the idea of kind of like your turn, my turn, spread pick and roll. Chris Paul and James Harden were two of the best pick and roll players in the league at that point, and they were both very good at beating switches and ISO. So they would just space the floor. Chris Paul and James Harden would run pick and roll. If they got a switch, they would attack in ISO. They would look for, Chris Paul would take some mid-range jump shots, but he was really the only guy on the team taking mid-ranges. It was a lot of threes, a lot of kick-out threes, step-back threes for James Harden. They had a vertical spacer and Clint Capella, a bunch of 3-and-D guys like Trevor Ariza, PJ Tucker, Luke Richard, and Bob Mute, who had a shoulder injury during that playoff run. They were awesome. They won 65 games. They were the best offense in the league. Again, I think they were like 7th or 8th in defense, but it was a defensive concept that was constructed for giving the Warriors issues. And their plan worked well. They managed to stagnate the Warriors offense by switching and baiting them into running a ton of ISO. And they scored just enough in some super ugly games to take a 3-2 lead in that series. But then, as we know, Chris Paul ends up getting injured, a hamstring pull down the end of that game 5. Now, I'm of the opinion that the Warriors would have won that series even if Chris Paul was healthy. I think they go home in game 6 and win to extend the series. And then a game 7 in Houston is a coin flip, but I'll go with the greatest roster ever assembled versus a James Harden-led team. But alas, we did not get to see that. We got to see them try to beat the Warriors without Chris Paul. They actually did an admirable job. They lost game 6, but they actually jumped off to a great start in game 7. They were up 11 at the half. But the Warriors finally kind of snapped out of it against the switching. Steph and KD both caught fire in the second half of that game, and they kind of just crushed the Rockets in the second half and ended up going on to the finals. And here's really where I start to, kind of solidify my take that I think the Warriors would have won anyway. The basketball gods just gift wrapped the Rockets the opportunity of a lifetime to get revenge in the following season. Chris Paul was healthy. Kevin Durant was hurt. You had an opportunity to win that series against just a Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green led Warriors team, and they just got absolutely annihilated by Steph Curry. And James Harden completely flamed out. He was awful down the stretch of that series. It's kind of just more reinforcing for me in that opinion that I think the Warriors would have won even if Chris Paul didn't get hurt. But it's worth mentioning that this is obviously one of the great non-champions ever because schematically they gave the greatest team ever some issues. And to put it simply, they were one win away from going to the finals. And in the finals, there was an extremely flawed one-man show Cavs team waiting. A Cavs team that, even with LeBron playing arguably the best basketball that's ever been played, they were barely squeaking by the Pacers and barely squeaking by the Celtics. So I think that Rockets team was incredibly close to winning the title. The 2002 Sacramento Kings come in at number 2. A super deep team built around Chris Webber and Mike Bibby and Peja Stojakovic. They had Vlade Divac, Doug Christie, a young Hito Turkoglu at that point, Bobby Jackson. They were a great team. They had lost to the Lakers twice before, but everything came together for them in 2002. They had the best record in the NBA by a decent margin. They were 3 games ahead of the Lakers, who were in second place that year. They quickly dispatched of the Jazz and the Mavs in the first 2 rounds. And then they dropped game 1 to the Lakers, looking like years past, but then they bang, bang, come back and win the next 2 games and take home court back. They're up 2-1. They split a couple of crazy games in game 4 and game 5. They have a 3-2 lead going back to Los Angeles. And they had the Lakers on the rope down the stretch of game 6. But the Lakers attempted 27 free throws just in the fourth quarter of a game that is widely regarded as the worst officiated game in the history of the NBA. And they ended up going on to lose in heartbreaking fashion. Now, I'm not a conspiracy guy, as you guys know. But Kings fans truly believe they got robbed of the title this season. And they were certainly as close to getting it done as anyone else on this list. Nothing more heartbreaking than from the start of the season, just clearly being the best team and conquering your demons and being right there at the finish line, and then you lose on some free throws. There's nothing that sucks more than that. Number one was an easy one for me. I think this team got so close so many times that they have to be number one. And if anybody remembers rooting against this team at any point in time, they were so physically imposing and so scary to play against. To me, the best team to never win a title is of the last 25 years is the Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, Oklahoma City Thunder. Also known as the team that blew a 3-1 lead to the team that blew a 3-1 lead. The KD Westbrook Thunder were a problem for like a half decade in the NBA. They were top 2 seed in 2012, 2013, and 2014. They had several super close calls. They made the finals in 2012, and the Heat won that series in 5, but every single game was a close game outside of the end of game 5, and there was even a questionable no call on a KD ISO along the left baseline at the end of game 2. In 2013, Russ gets hurt, but in 2014, they're right back. And they end up losing to the Spurs in the conference finals in game 6. That was one of the great Spurs teams. They made our list yesterday, if you guys remember. And game 6 was in overtime. So the Thunder were game 7 in San Antonio, the Spurs probably win, but they came closer to beating that Spurs team than anyone else did. KD gets hurt in 2015. And then in 2016, they have yet another close call. In my opinion, the best version of the Thunder. They beat a 67-win Spurs team. And they were up 3-1 on the 73-win Warriors. Predictably, the Warriors end up winning game 5 at home, as you would expect a team that good at home to do in a closeout game. But in game 6, in Oklahoma City, they come out, guns blazing, play extremely well for the most part. But a combination of some hero ball from Russell Westbrook down the stretch, some key mistakes from him, and probably the greatest game Klay Thompson ever played, the remarkable game 6 Klay moment, ended up being enough to send that to game 7, where Steph was fantastic in game 7 and the Warriors ended up winning the series. Had they won that series, I know it was LeBron waiting in the next round and Kyrie and all that, but like, you'd be foolish to think that they didn't at least have a very good chance. They came this close to beating 140 wins worth of teams in the Spurs in the Thunder in the previous round. So 130 wins worth of teams, I should say. No, it was 140. If I'm doing my math right. So yeah, like you'd be foolish to think they didn't have a very good chance, right? So they were physically overwhelming on defense. They were absolutely massive, strong, athletic. They had Andre Roberson on the wing, Serge Ibaka and Steven Adams. They really wore teams down physically over the course of series. And Kevin Durant wasn't his most efficient playoff run, but he scored enough when he needed to keep the team chugging along. And they were led by 2 of the all-time greats. Several near misses with the trophies. I think they're clearly the best non-champion of the last 25 years. All right, guys, that's all I have for today. As always, I sincerely appreciate you guys for supporting us and supporting the show. We will be back tomorrow. We have 2 more top 10 lists this week. I will see you guys then.